If you are still outside of the auditorium, you might want to come back in. We're going to get started in a minute. Okay, welcome back. Our final, but by no means least, presenter this afternoon is art historian Mark Levitch. Mark is a researcher and writer at the National Gallery of Art. He is the author of Panthéon de la Guerre, Reconfiguring a Panorama of the Great War, as well as several essays on French and American World War I art and visual culture, including most recently an article on World War I memorials for the Cambridge History of American Literature and Culture of the First World War. Before starting his graduate studies in art history, Mark worked for 9 years as an intelligence analyst for European affairs at the State Department. And if you haven't had a chance to see the Panthéon, I strongly recommend getting over there if you can. Mark Levitch.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Volume good? Okay, great. Excuse me. Let's see. Well, several years ago, while browsing on eBay, I recognized what I thought was a piece of the Panthéon de la Guerre, an enormous World War I panoramic painting. I wasn't positive, and the seller's description was no help. It called the fragment, seen at right, a painting of a French military parade, circa 1900, and it equally touted the patina of the frame and the circa 1960 amateur still life painted on its reverse. I scoured my various Panthéon de la Guerre catalogs and postcards, and after my eureka moment, you see its original location on the left there in the outline box. I bought the tiny, battered, and misidentified fragment of the Panthéon for the reserve price of $99. It was an ignominious, but also fitting end, one of many ends, actually, to what was the single most ambitious wartime artistic effort to commemorate the Great War. Today, I'd like to sketch out for you the Panthéon's history, including what it looked like originally, the remarkable journey that took it from World War I Paris to this place during the Cold War, where an abridged version hangs today, and how its appearance and meaning have changed over time. In its original guise, the Panthéon was an immense circular panorama, also known as a cyclorama, that was billed as the world's largest painting. And one entered this from below and emerged in the center, and then you were completely surrounded by this gargantuan canvas. And I'll come back to this model in a bit to show some details. The project was a complex mélange of art, commerce, patriotism, propaganda, and commemoration. It was conceived and overseen by two well-known academic painters, Pierre Carrière-Bellouze and Auguste-François Gourguet, who are seen here in the center together. They were assisted by 17 other established painters, all decently known, and hundreds of assistants. Nearly all the principal artists were gentlemen of a certain age. Too old to serve militarily, they felt compelled as loyal citizens, but also as otherwise seemingly useless non-combatant males, to support the French war effort. The Panthéon's creation coincided almost perfectly with the duration of the war. Carrière-Bellouze and Gourguet began their work after the French defensive victory at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, a month after the war started. And French President Poincaré inaugurated it in Paris amid great fanfare in October 1918, 4 years after the artists started their work and just 3 weeks before the armistice. Structurally, the project was an unusual hybrid. A private commercial enterprise, it nonetheless received official support from French government and military authorities who recognized its propaganda value. The final work was celebrated as a grandiose monument to the war's heroes, known and unknown. A building to house it, which you see here, was erected on government-allotted land in Paris near the historic Invalides, which of course has great meaning military-wise in France. Measuring an astounding 402 feet in circumference by 45 feet high, the Panthéon contained about 5,000 full-length portraits of notable wartime figures from France and France's allies. The two principal artists themselves sketched hundreds of the war's leading personalities from life. Here you see on the left a pastel study by French General Gallieni, a pivotal figure in the Battle of the Marne, by Carrière-Bellouze, who only worked in pastels, and on the right a study in oil by Gourguet of popular writer Pierre Loti. There are about 200 of these, or 300 of these painted studies that were also shown alongside with the Panthéon in Paris. And I know of at least a couple hundred that are still floating around. Other artists also made sketches from life, or, for those dead or otherwise unavailable, from photographs. Such was the case here. These are two of the three Doumer brothers who were killed in the war. Their father, a high-ranking politician, became president of France in 1931. René, on the right, was an aviator. And see if we can see what it says. It's hard to read, but these are sketches that were made by probably in the thousands for the Staircase of Heroes. And I found these after the book was published, but I have found them to be of immense use because they give details such as the names of people who are not otherwise named in the painting, and details usually about their physical appearance, including their hair color and how tall they were, as well as their orders that they had, the citations they had received, and so they would know how to put them into the painting with the proper citations. And you can see on René's on the bottom right there, with the little cross above it, it says disparu, killed. The Panthéon's largest section and principal focus was a temple of glory dedicated to French heroes. And this is where the Doumer brothers are, and this is where my little piece was. And the aviators, generally speaking, are over here. And you can still see a couple of them in the piece that is in the museum building that's there. The temple and its long staircase were crowded with animated portraits of thousands of figures, mostly bemedaled soldiers selected from war citations, many of whom had been killed. At the base of the stairs, a golden-winged victory statue soared upwards from a pedestal engraved "To the Heroes." And there you see the Gallic cock. France's leading military, government, and civilian figures stood at the base of the pedestal, flanking a beloved French 75mm cannon, which was the workhorse of the French army. The cannon, in turn, sat atop German standards captured at the Battle of the Marne. These are the only acknowledgement of the enemy in the painting. And that's Guerre. So he does have pride of place among the thousands. At the temple's wings, French soldiers streamed back from the front to parade victoriously before the heroes, thus making the Panthéon's spatial and temporal framework the fantasized post-victory return of French troops from the front. And so again, this is the model showing where the staircase is. Oops. That's the Staircase of Heroes with its thousands of portraits. This is a monument to the dead, which I'll talk about in a second, and these are the national sections linking the staircase, linking the temple to the monument to the dead. The monument to the dead was an immense, sober monument engraved pro patria. At its summit, massive bronze French soldiers held aloft a coffin draped with the French flag, which unfortunately we cannot see in this reproduction. And I should just say quickly that it's very hard to only work with reproductions except for what has survived and is available here. So it's hard to get a lot of clarity from some of the images. At its base, a mourning female figure kneels, weeping, a wreath next to her dedicated to the unknown heroes. And this is obviously supposed to recall Mary weeping at the foot of the cross. Leading figures from France's 23 allies played an integral but ultimately supporting role. They were grouped by nation in two symmetrical hemicycles that linked the temple and the monument on either side. France's 4 West European allies were ranged against one wall. They're on that side. And the remaining 19 allies, including the United States, were placed against the other. And so the earliest allies get the most space, and then the other allies had to share smaller space. The Panthéon was largely scripted in the earliest stages of the war. They had their sort of main outline for this thing in 1915. But it required frequent rewrites to keep up with the war's developments, because again, this is happening as the war is going on. 1917 proved a particularly challenging year, as you might imagine. When the US entered the war in April, the nearly finished Panorama had to be drastically adjusted. To properly accommodate its important new partner, the artist had to redo a 32-foot-long section of the Panthéon that had been entirely devoted to France's Far East allies. In their place, the Panthéon's artists hastily assembled a dynamic composition that centered on Woodrow Wilson delivering the April 2nd, 1917 speech before Congress, in which he urged that the US join the war. And you might be able to see that there are a few Asian figures over here, which are sort of what's left of the Asian section. A few months later, the Panthéon's artists had to wrestle with another world-changing and therefore composition-changing event, the Russian Revolution. In the end, they acknowledged both Russia's key role as an ally and its withdrawal from the alliance following the Bolshevik takeover. Most of the section is dominated by Russia as ally. Tsar Nicholas II is in the center, and his son in a Cossack uniform stands just in front of him. But these old Russian figures abut an allegorical representation of history who is inscribing the dates of the now terminated Franco-Russian alliance on a marble tablet. A hulking Bolshevik abutting the tablet is portrayed as having just dropped the torch with which he set Russia afire. And look where the smoke goes. The smoke wafts across the old Russia section, just reaching Tsar Nicholas, and by the time this was done, of course, the Tsar was dead, as was his child. From conception through completion, the Pantheon was a stylistically and ideologically conservative attempt to encapsulate the war, one seemingly more suited to the 19th century than the 20th. It is overloaded with reassuring classical references, including its name, which pointed simultaneously to the ancient Roman Pantheon and to the Paris resting place of France's great men, its painted architectural framework, and the building constructed to house it. With these references, its glorification of individual heroism, the almost complete absence of anonymous modern mechanical war, and its prominent placement of nationalist stalwarts, the Pantheon embodied an utterly orthodox replay of wartime propaganda. The Pantheon's unique figuring of this traditional approach, however, led perhaps 8 million people to visit it in Paris between 1918 and 1927. Why and how did this passé representation of modern industrial war resonate with these visitors? The answer, I think, lay primarily in the Pantheon's ability to impart meaning to the war and its sacrifices. At once celebratory and funerary, it provided a seemingly commensurable vision of the war that encouraged viewers to regard the conflict as a definitively finished and therefore comprehensible historical event. It also provided a meaningful visual summation of a war that in its momentousness, duration, modernity, and horror had seemed impossible to grasp, either visually or conceptually. The new preeminence of photography and film effectively marked this conflict as the first media war. But after years of fragmentary documentary images, artists and the public alike were eager for representations that could synthesize, or at least summarize, and impose some order on the inchoate and devastating war experience. No medium was more suited to synthesis than the panorama, a word that comes from the Greek for see all. Encircled by the enormous painted canvas, the viewer had an unparalleled sense of omniscience, totality, and complete control. The entire war, seemingly, was within one's grasp. The encyclopedic nature of the Pantheon is encapsulated not only in the portraits, but also in the topographical landscape map of the nearly 500-mile-long Western Front, seen from a bird's-eye view, which took up nearly half the area of the panorama. And of this, there are very few remnants, almost no remnants, and very few good reproductions. So what you see here, obviously, this is the American section at bottom, and I've highlighted that little section and blown it up on top. And you can see, you can at least read Verdun there. And Verdun was the only one that was done in gold lettering. The rest were all black letters. And you can, it's hard to make out those even that are there. I think I see Bois-le-Duc and more Ohm on the top left. But this was, people were absolutely astounded by this map, which was both landscape painting and map. And I'm sorry that I don't have better things. I'm sorry that I've never seen it. Yet if the Pantheon provided a plausible total vision of the war, it was a vision enmeshed in nostalgia. By representing the Great War in traditional visual terms, the Pantheon suggested that while this war was larger in scale, it was not fundamentally different in kind. On the contrary, the Pantheon portrayed the conflict as a discrete event that could now assume its place in a larger national historical narrative crowded with other glorious wars. The panorama medium itself was a throwback to the 19th century. The panorama craze had faded rapidly with the advent of film in 1895, and by the turn of the century, let alone 1918, the panorama was largely obsolete. Finally, by its inauguration in 1918, the Pantheon's uniquely individualized, heroic presentation of the war could also be construed as nostalgic. The Pantheon's portraits, especially those like this on the Staircase of Heroes, not only contested the war's facelessness, but also offered consolation by refusing to privilege the war's mass death. This is a portrait of Colonel Drian, a politician and popular writer who enlisted at age 59 and was killed at Verdun. And you can see how closely it hewed to the news photo on which it was based, down to the wristwatch poking out of the sleeve. By making and you can see what a small element it is of the Staircase of Heroes. By making portraiture the touchstone of the entire work, the artists, on an unsurpassed scale, highlighted the human face and individual expression as a form of resistance to the anonymity of modern war. And so this is Drian, one impressive story, but one of many. And you can guess that all of these people have similar stories. And it's not only that they are all pictured, but they are pictured as essentially living, active people. It's almost like a photo in Harry Potter. You see the people sort of talking to each other, shaking hands, leaning over, gesturing, smoking, raising binoculars in some cases, and looking back at you, the viewer. So it's fairly interactive in that way. The Pantheon was most popular before and immediately after the armistice, when the joy and relief of France's victory were still fresh. As the 1920s progressed, however, the French were less intent on reliving or celebrating the war than on forgetting it. But not so for the Americans. With its sizable American section, the Pantheon for several years stood as the most significant recognition in France of U.S. participation in the war, and many U.S.-sponsored war ceremonies were held at the Panorama, especially when you consider how long it took to build the American cemeteries and monuments. The Pantheon became a regular stop for the many American soldiers who passed through Paris before shipping back to the States. This is a page from an anonymous soldier's photo album that includes 3 photos of the Pantheon at bottom. Another doughboy, Robert Godby, visiting the Pantheon in 1919, noted in his journal that the painting was, quote, without a doubt the most remarkable painting in the world, end quote. Artillery Captain and later President Harry Truman concurred, writing his cousin after he visited it in 1919, quote, I guess people will come from the ends of the earth to see it when the tourist traffic is resumed, end quote. And he was right. The Pantheon became a staple of the tourist circuit, especially for Americans who visited the city in ever greater numbers in the 1920s. And sort of one telltale sign of this is if you go on eBay and look up the Panthéon de la Guerre, you will find a zillion pieces of info there, postcard sets and things like that. Yet, even if the French had largely stopped visiting the Pantheon, many resented its 1927 purchase by U.S. businessmen who foresaw profits in taking it on an American tour. The French took little solace in the new owner's promise at a high-profile ceremony, farewell ceremony, that the Pantheon would be returned to France. And this is the photos from the farewell ceremony, which included the French Minister of War and the U.S. Ambassador. And again, this is 1927, so this is 9 years after the armistice. And the invitation to the farewell ceremony on the left. And you can see how big the package was, and part of the interest in the Panthéon de la Guerre obviously has always been its size, but sort of the idea of moving this through France and onto a ship and across the Atlantic drew a lot of attention. The Pantheon's interwar tour, which included 5 lengthy exhibitions at cities across the U.S. between 1927 and 1940, marked a fundamental and enduring change in its existence and meaning. For U.S. viewers, the Pantheon offered a chance to relive their victory by bridging the distance, temporally, spatially, and mentally, that separated them from the hardships of wartime France. An opening day ad in the New York Times, for instance, at top left, proclaimed that in the Panthéon one could see, quote, "the battlefields of France brought to America." For the US tour, which started at Madison Square Garden, you see a billboard advertising that at top right, the American section was given a substantial makeover. As seen here at bottom, several figures, including women and an African American, were added to make the French-focused panorama more appealing to a US audience. A still more drastic and attention-grabbing change involved a quasi-Stalinist painting out of a controversial US political figure, Colonel Edward House, a key wartime advisor and confidant of President Wilson. House had had a friendship-ending falling out with President Wilson at the Versailles Treaty negotiations. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which sponsored the Pantheon's US tour to raise funds to purchase Monticello, was run by Democrats who had served prominently in the Wilson administration and who were still leading lights in the Democratic Party. They despised House, whose recently published memoirs lambasted Wilson's leadership. Seeing Colonel House's prominent presence as an embarrassment, they apparently made their sponsorship of the Pantheon's US tour contingent upon House's removal. Shortly before the Panthéon left Paris for New York, a French artist painted the longtime US ambassador to France, Myron Herrick, over the figure of Colonel House, igniting the first controversy over the Pantheon's fidelity to historical accuracy. The Panthéon would forever be an artifact of the war, but as a document about the war, it would now be periodically updated to reflect contemporary conceptions of the war and its ongoing relevance. The Panthéon had always been a commercial venture, but in France this had been concealed for fear of tarnishing its seemingly more high-minded patriotic ideals and commemorative function. Americans, however, were unfazed by treating the formerly sacral Panthéon as entertainment. Indeed, its owners promoted it as a spectacle, perhaps to compensate for the symbolic resonance it had possessed inherently in Paris. The spectacularization of the Panthéon involved increasingly crass circus-like advertising, as seen in this ad from its 1939 exhibition in Washington, D.C., the Panorama's second stop on its US tour. It also entailed, importantly, a new focus on the sheer size of the painting and the logistics of transporting it, which rendered the Panthéon a curiosity and came to overshadow its content. The Panthéon never drew the huge crowds in the US that its owners had anticipated. It fared decently at the Chicago Century of Progress exhibition in 1933 and 1934, but its owners, eager to draw more paying visitors, chafed at the refusal of Chicago fair officials to allow the Panthéon to use more aggressive marketing methods, including huge advertising signs and loudspeakers. After being ordered by fair officials to clean up their act, the Pantheon's head of publicity fired back in writing, quote, "You are killing off the initiative of the showmen in connection with running their own shows. You are killing off the carnival spirit, which is necessary to make a World's Fair a success. Too much dignity in a World's Fair is bad, B-A-D underlined, capital letters." And they tried to do things like set up makeshift trenches. They brought in fortune tellers. They were doing everything they could to try to make a buck, including mounting machine guns on top of the building, actually. The Pantheon's owners declared that after Chicago, the Panorama would travel to South America. But this was nothing more than another disingenuous marketing ploy. The Panorama's appeal fell off precipitously through the 1930s. Partly a function of time, the Pantheon's sagging fortunes also reflected growing US isolationism. It was exhibited again in 1936 and 1937 at the Cleveland Great Lakes Exhibition, but by the time of its 1940 exhibition at the Golden Gate International Fair in San Francisco, Europe was again at war, the US was not, and the Panthéon seemed irrelevant. This admission ticket from the San Francisco Expo reflects the painting's sagging fortunes. the ticket could be used for one of 3 shows: the Panthéon, the African Jungle Camp, or the Hollywood show Stage 9. After the San Francisco Expo, the Panthéon was put in storage in Baltimore, pending more auspicious conditions. In fact, though, conditions would never again be auspicious. The Panthéon was stored outdoors in its immense wooden crate and forgotten. With its owner thousands of dollars in arrears, the storage company put the Panthéon up for auction in 1952, as seen in this announcement. William Hausner, a German World War I veteran who had emigrated to the US and opened a well-known restaurant in Baltimore, if anybody's from Baltimore, they may know it, outbid a handful of scrap metal dealers eager for the painting's tons of armature. And you can see that it was advertised as an art object with unusual salvage value. It was believed people were not going to be that interested in the art, but it had metal. Hausner, an avid art collector, paid $3,400 for a painting that had reportedly been sold for $500,000 30 years earlier. The next year, 1953, when Hausner had the football field-sized painting that he had never seen unrolled at a circus lot, Life magazine sent a photographer to cover the event from a helicopter. So this is really the only image that I have that gives you a sense of how immense this thing was. And that's Hausner there standing on it. You can also see that it's not in good physical shape, especially the area above the figures and above the pylons all the way across. It's been eaten through. It was rolled up, so something got into the box and just ate right through the canvas in the same spot. Among those who saw the life story was Daniel McMorris, a Kansas City artist and First World War veteran who had studied painting in Paris in the early 1920s with none other than Guerre, one of the Panorama's 2 principal French artists. McMorris knew the Panthéon intimately because he had often visited it with Guerre when he was his student in Paris. And I get the sense that Guerre and Carrière-Belleuse actually hung out one day a week at the Panorama when it was open in Paris, because there's tons of stuff signed by them. And so I think they signed postcard sets and things like that. And now McMorris, who was in his 60s and a successful artist, recognized a unique opportunity. He was at the time in charge of overseeing the decoration of the Liberty Memorial here, the US's most important World War I commemorative structure. He, in fact, had competed for the first mural that's in the memorial building upstairs and had lost that, and he competed for that when he was still studying with Guerre. McMorris envisioned using a portion of his teacher's work to cover a 60-foot-long wall in one of the memorial's buildings, in Memorial Hall upstairs. Oops, sorry. McMorris contacted Hausner and was disappointed to learn that the Baltimore restaurateur was determined to preserve the Panthéon whole. And Hausner gave it a real shot. There's correspondence of him writing museums, I think he wrote the Smithsonian, among other places, trying to get somebody to take this thing. And he was going to donate it. But a decade after but McMorris persisted, and the Kansas City artist's patience paid off. A decade after World War II, and amid the new uncertainties of the Cold War, Hausner could not find any organization or museum willing to pay for a building to house a panorama commemorating what was by then a fairly distant conflict. In late 1956, Hausner, frustrated and in frail health, gave in to McMorris's entreaties. He donated the Panthéon to the Liberty Memorial and gave McMorris carte blanche to dismember it for the Kansas City landmark. So one portion is in one of those buildings, and the other portion's in the other one of those buildings. This is McMorris taking possession of the Panthéon. It's being loaded onto a train car. He's standing on top of the crate, and that is it being unloaded on the plaza in front of the buildings near the tower there on the right. McMorris's changes were by far the most dramatic the Panthéon had undergone. He took liberties with the painting that today look cavalier, if not negligent. He cut it up, drastically reconfigured it, overpainted figures, and gave small sections to friends. Most distressingly, McMorris apparently simply threw away huge swaths of the original Panorama that he could not use in his reworked composition. McMorris had no qualms about eviscerating the painting. It was deteriorating in outdoor storage, and nobody wanted to house it whole. Using part of it in a First World War memorial would at least preserve some portion of it in an appropriate setting. And this is in Memorial Hall where it hangs now. That's where they did a lot of the work. McMorris's configuration, which he compared incriminatingly, I think, to whittling down a novel for Reader's Digest, was nevertheless technically masterful. He cut and pasted what he considered the most important sections, repainted several figures and passages for reasons of scale or composition, and painted over the seams to make it appear a single work. Collaging together 23 pieces from the original Panorama, he reduced it to less than 7% of its original size. The resulting serpentine composition contains about 250 figures, including many, but certainly not all, of the most prominent personalities from the original. It was dedicated on Veterans Day, 1959, 41 years after its original dedication. And so this is what it looks like now in Memory Hall. While technically accomplished, McMorris transformed the focus and intent of the Panthéon's French creators by making the American section the centerpiece. After giving the U.S. pride of place, McMorris put a condensed version of the French section to the right of the U.S. panel. So instead of the U.S. being one of France's allies, as it was in the original, now France is depicted as one among many U.S. allies. So all those figures that were at the base of the Staircase of Heroes have been condensed to about a dozen figures there, including Guinemer, who made the cut. McMorris emphatically denied that putting the U.S. center stage meant privileging U.S.'s national contribution to the war. His purpose, he said, was, quote, not the glorification of the USA, but instead to render homage to Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, the inception of the United Nations today, end quote. He even fabricated a Wilsonian quote. He called it a distillation of Wilson's words and spread it prominently across the top of the composition. It's hard to read, but it says, "We demand human justice and peace sustained by the laws of men based on the tenets of God to make the world free," end quote. With his own peculiar sense of historical authenticity, McMorris also added several figures to the U.S. section. These included President Franklin Roosevelt, who had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the war, and more problematically, Kansas City hometown favorite Harry Truman, who had only been an artillery captain in the war. McMorris also painted Colonel House back into the U.S. section, even though doing so required overpainting an existing figure of an American soldier that he claimed, conveniently, could not be identified. McMorris also paid homage to the two principal French painters of the Panthéon, his mentor Guerrer and Carrier Bellouse, whom he painted next to each other at the far left of the canvas, and he included their original signatures. Through his reconfiguration, McMorris fundamentally transformed the Panorama into a Cold War-inflected nationalist construction of the First World War. The war is no longer presented as a great and costly test passed by the French nation with like-minded allies, but as the ushering in of the American century, an idea conveyed forcefully through the heightened profile of the flag-bearing U.S. figures, who appear to be strutting onto the international stage, and through the bouquet set at Wilson's feet, presumably by America's grateful allies who now incline compositionally toward the U.S. section. In the original composition, this same bouquet had been set before Edith Cavell, an English nurse whose summary execution in Belgium at the hands of the Germans in 1915 had caused international outrage and cemented the Allied image of the Germans as barbarous Huns. Although McMorris jettisoned most of the panorama, including the Monument to the Dead, the entire landscape, and numerous significant figures, he preserved the Staircase of Heroes and was later able to incorporate most of this section into a second building at the Liberty Memorial. That would be the museum building. Yet the effect of this fragment also is unsettling because it was cut like wallpaper to fit the available space. Dozens of portraits are cut in half where the wall ends or where a doorway pierces the work in the center, disfiguring croppings that call attention to its status as a fragment. And among those cut were most of the aviators. That's Dorm and Nungesser, I believe, but there were several to the right of that who were cut out. And more fragments keep turning up. First, I found that small eBay piece that I showed in the introduction. And then later, as I was browsing through a Paris flea market, I was astounded to see in the window of an antique store the Panthéon's two huge cavalry passages. McMorris, who did not use these pieces, had sent them back to William Hausner, the Baltimore restaurateur, who proudly displayed them in his art and bric-a-brac-filled restaurant until it closed in 1999. The enormous pieces, each 10 feet high and 16 feet wide, were then auctioned off with miscellaneous restaurant memorabilia, including the restaurant's locally famous 825-pound ball of string. These cavalry pieces, which are still for sale in Paris, remain the only portions of the original panorama to have made the promised return journey to France. Neither piece, however, looks exactly as it did when the Panthéon left Paris in 1927. So the originals are at top and the redone versions at the bottom. Each has had its background repainted. The elegant cuirassiers at left now blow their bugles in the garden of a French chateau rather than at the head of the French troops returning from the trenches. More jarringly still, the North African goumiers at right have been transposed to a generic desert setting where they now storm past camels, palm trees, and Bedouins. Giving the goumiers such a prominent position in the original composition had been an uncommonly generous show of respect for the North African colonial troops who had traveled to, fought, and died in France to defend the French nation. With its new background, however, the Goumier passage has been unabashedly retrofitted into an Orientalist painting tradition of exotic and timeless stereotypes. This is the Panthéon de la Guerre building in the 1960s. It says La Montagne à Paris across the front, the mountain in Paris, and it was an indoor ski jump spectacle for a few years, and then it became a garage. The Panthéon and its history as object and representation can be viewed as a metaphor for World War I itself and for how the war has been and continues to be remembered. The French artist's traditional approach to commemorating the war, a painted panorama replete with classical references and paeans to individual heroism, reflected the widespread belief in 1914 that the war would resemble previous conflicts. Precisely because it did not, the Panthéon's passéisme provided a welcome dose of nostalgia afterwards. In the end, however, the history of the war refused to be neatly summed up in a single traditional work, no matter how large. The circular format of the original panorama implied the possibility of total comprehension of the war, its complete legibility, and final closure that the war and its memory continue to deny. The Panthéon's story is in many ways tragic. but the seeds of the work's dismemberment were embodied in its anachronistic treatment of the first modern industrialized total war. The Panthéon de la Guerre is no longer the encompassing monument its creators envisioned, yet its fragmentation and ongoing dispersal are, in the end, a more accurate reflection both of the war's modernist impact and of how the war itself has been remembered and forgotten. Thank you.
As always, if there are any questions, please feel free to come down and step up to a microphone. Mike.
Dueling mics.
Go ahead, Carl.
No, you go.
No, you go. No.
No, you go.
All right, I'll go. So this is more of a, not quite a question, but a statement. I had, as long as I've been studying the war and as long as I've been an artist and painter, I had never heard this tale about the Panthéon. And Mark came out to a Western Front Association event 20 years ago, 15 years ago. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
And told this story, and you could tell who the aviation and World War I history people were because they were nice and quiet and respectful for the whole thing. And then you could tell who the artists in the room were because every time he said, and then they cut the painting up, there was a gasp in the audience. And then, of course, the results of this thing are that part of it was preserved. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody here, before you leave, if you haven't already gone over and seen the one part of the Panthéon, the staircase of heroes that is still available to see, the other part is closed off right now for renovation. If you have not been over there yet, please go over there and see it. It's as a painter, it's literally a stunning piece of work. And you have to try to imagine that in its original format, what you're looking at is a 24-foot, 28-foot wall maybe, that thing was 45 feet high, and that the bottom part of that has been excised. So just the scale of it, I can't even hardly wrap my head around it. But I wanted to thank Mark. I invited him out to this event, and Mark agreed to come out, as most of the presenters have done on their own dime. And Mark, I want to just say thank you publicly for making that effort. We appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Compliments to your discourse on this. And I'll posit that had it not come to America, it probably would have been destroyed by the Nazis.
Yeah, certainly.
Think of it in those terms.
Right.
The fact that it went through the degradation that it did and the dismemberment is reprehensible, in many terms.
Yeah.
But the fact that it came meant that in some form it survived. Do you agree?
I agree. And I have to say, there's not a history of panoramas surviving. They were very popular in the 19th century, but they're hard to store. They kind of need their own buildings. They did figure out a system, as you saw, when this one was rolled up, a way to roll it up and send it to another venue. But it was a fairly short-lived exercise.
So I was struck by your presentation and the contrast to Roger's presentation seemed to be inextricably linked. It's like what happened to the Panthéon is what's happening to the World War I portion of Air and Space. And more or less...
I was happy to hear they're keeping the World War I
so
section, that they didn't go with the Disney guy.
So it's just, as we get smaller and more artifacts get added to the collection, the number of space is not increased, our portion gets smaller and gets cut and poured around. That's not to say that, we appreciate that we're still being preserved, but it's just like, here is the one hand and here is the other hand, and they seem to be inextricably linked, especially since you guys are coming from the same place. Thank you.
So Mark, just
hi,
a quick question. So talk about the progression. So it started after the Battle of the Marne, which was, what was the date of that? I don't recall off the top of my head. And so they were like, okay, we have all these guys that were heroes in this, and it might have been however big it was. And then the war progressed, and so they had to add, but they had no idea it would last 4 years.
No.
So how did they do that?
I don't exactly know how they did it. I know that they had an approved sort of preliminary sketch when they incorporated in 1915, towards the end of 1915. And of course, allies just kept joining. But I suspect that they would have, I mean, the building had to be in train from, I don't know how long it took them to build the building. But my guess is at least a couple years. So I'm sure they had the dimensions that they were going to make this thing down. There had already been so many people slaughtered, even just in the first month of the war, that I'm sure they knew they could fill up a staircase or something. And so I suspect that they just ad-libbed, essentially.
So it was probably something in French, similar to we're going to need a bigger canvas.
Yeah.
And then Jaws became we're going to need a bigger net, right?
Exactly. And more artists, please. All right.
Thank you. And that does it for our first in-person seminar since 2018. We're so glad that you all could make it, and to see, like I said, as we started, old faces, new friends, new experiences, new information. We need to thank a few people again. Laura Vogt, Haley Sheriff, and all the guest services people at the museum. Jake up in the booth, running the AV, Melody in catering. Everything that they did made this a very well thought out and easy to do event. Carl Bobrow lined up speakers, including contacting Al Rossler the day before he was traveling, and Al stepping up, and Ted Hoosher stepping up. All of our presenters, Larry Burke, Chris Moore, Christopher Warren. I'm going to forget some, so I'm going to look down. Ted Hoosher, Chris Moore, Roger Connor, Greg Van Weingarten, Mark Levitch. Thank all of you. Thank you, all of you. We are talking on the board about putting together our next seminar in 2025. So we've started those discussions. If you have thoughts on what we might be doing or where we might be going, feel free to contact a board member, contact me, contact Carl. A few of you have asked about potential discount on aeronaut books. We're working on that. We think that Jack is going to do that, but Jack is busy right now with some stuff, and he's getting calling hours back out of the country. He's okay, so we'll let you know. We have your email addresses, so look for your email. And once again, thank you for coming, and the shuttle leaves at 5.